The old veteran was just boarding his flight until an injured U.S. Marine collapsed at security. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was a crisp morning at the airport, the hum of the overhead lights mixing with the low murmur of travelers. Among them, an elderly man stood at the check-in counter, his hands shaking slightly as he fumbled with his ticket. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, though tired, held a sharpness that seemed out of place for someone his age. Martin Kelly, 87 years old, had seen more in his lifetime than most people could ever imagine. Dressed simply in a worn jacket and khaki pants, he hardly stood out in the crowd. His medal, however, hung around his neck, a simple but significant reminder of a past he had long since buried. As he moved toward the security line, a young TSA agent stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment," the agent said, his tone flat but firm. Martin didn't flinch. He had been stopped before, although never like this. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice calm but steady. The agent glanced down at the medal around Martin's neck. "What's that?" he asked, eyeing the decoration. Martin didn't respond immediately. He could tell by the agent's tone that the young man wasn't sure if the medal was real or just a prop. "It's a Medal of Honor," Martin said softly. "I've earned it." The agent scoffed, clearly not impressed. "Yeah, right?" he muttered under his breath. "You need to take that off. Airport policy." Martin raised an eyebrow. He had heard this all before, but something about the agent's dismissive attitude rubbed him the wrong way. "I'm not taking it off," Martin said simply. The agent smirked and gestured for his supervisor. "We've got a situation here," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. The supervisor, a man in his 30s, came over and glanced at Martin's medal. "This isn't a parade ground, old man. You need to follow the rules," he said, his tone unyielding. Martin didn't move, his expression unwavering. "I'm not here to argue," he said quietly. "I just need to board my flight." But the agent's frustration only grew. "This is a restricted area," the supervisor insisted. "You can't just come in here wearing something like that." "It's not just something," Martin replied. "It's earned." A few people in line began to notice the interaction. Their eyes darted nervously between Martin and the agents, unsure of what to make of the standoff. As the tension began to rise, an unexpected sound interrupted the growing confrontation. A loud thud echoed from the security checkpoint, followed by a man's voice gasping for breath. "Help me!" The agents turned toward the noise, just in time to see a young U.S. Marine, clearly injured, collapse to the ground in front of the scanners. His uniform was torn, and blood stained his fatigues. The supervisor rushed to his side, barking orders for medical assistance. But Martin's eyes remained fixed on the scene. He had seen enough of this in his time. Without a word, he moved forward, his instincts kicking in. "Get the hell back," the supervisor snapped, raising a hand. But Martin ignored him, stepping around the young agent and kneeling beside the fallen Marine. The young man's breath was ragged, his eyes wide with fear. "Help me, please," he muttered, reaching out weakly. Martin took a breath, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He quickly applied pressure to the Marine's wound, his voice calm. "Hold on, son. Just hold on." The supervisor, still standing in shock, finally snapped back into reality. "We need paramedics now," he shouted. But it was too late. The medical team was already on their way, and Martin had done more than enough to stabilize the Marine. The young agent watched in stunned silence as Martin worked with the precision of someone who had been in this situation countless times. For a moment, there was only the sound of Martin's steady breath and the weak groans of the injured Marine. The airport seemed to fade away as the two men, one old, one young, shared a quiet, unspoken bond. "You're a hero," the supervisor said, his voice barely a whisper. Martin looked up, his face calm, but with a deep sadness in his eyes. "I'm just doing what I've always done," he replied. "It's what I was trained for." Just then, a new voice broke the tension. A man in a sharp military uniform stepped forward, flanked by two officers. The supervisor straightened up, clearly recognizing the figure. "Sir, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice suddenly respectful. The man nodded solemnly, his gaze turning to Martin. "I'm here for him," the man said. "This is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly." The agent's face fell as he realized the weight of his mistake. Without a word, the general walked toward Martin, offering a firm salute. The old veteran returned the salute, his hand trembling slightly as he did so. "It's an honor to meet you, sir," the general said, "and I apologize for the misunderstanding." Martin simply nodded, his eyes shifting back to the Marine, who was now being tended to by paramedics. "No harm done," he said quietly. "Let's get this young man the help he needs. I will continue the story from where we left off." The general stood tall, his uniform immaculate, as the medical team quickly took charge of the injured Marine. Martin Kelly, still on his knees, remained calm, his weathered hands steady as he assisted with the Marine's care. The young agents, still in shock, began to move out of the way, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The general's eyes, however, never left Martin. He had seen the name on the security logs and now knew exactly who this man was. His heart swelled with respect for the quiet veteran who had done so much more than his fair share. "Sergeant Major Kelly." The general finally spoke, his voice low but filled with reverence. "It's an honor." Martin looked up, locking eyes with the general. His face, though aged and marked by the passage of time, still carried the same intensity that had defined his years of service. He nodded slowly. "I've been called worse, sir." The general chuckled softly, a brief break in his otherwise stern demeanor. "We need to get you off this floor, Sergeant Major. Let's make sure you get where you need to go." The paramedics wheeled the Marine off toward the waiting ambulance, and the general gestured for Martin to follow him. As they walked, the general's staff cleared a path, their faces filled with surprise and awe as they recognized the man who had stood beside their fallen comrades decades ago. Martin, though silent, felt a pang of sorrow. He had been to too many funerals, said too many goodbyes. "Sir, I wasn't looking for recognition," Martin said, his voice soft but firm. "I was just helping him, like I've always done." The general nodded solemnly. "I understand. But we both know that what you did today is more than a simple act of kindness." As they approached the back door of the terminal, Martin's eyes flicked to the Marine who had collapsed. The young man was still unconscious, his body limp in the paramedic's arms. He had been only a child when Martin was fighting in jungles and deserts, and now here he was, fighting for his life. It reminded Martin of how much had changed, but also how little had. The door to the terminal opened with a quiet hiss, and the general motioned for Martin to step inside. "We've arranged a private room for you," the general said, leading the way. The door closed behind them, and the general turned to face Martin. "Sergeant Major, there's something I need to ask you." Martin, who had been gazing out of the window at the distant plains, turned to meet the general's eyes. "Go ahead, sir." The general hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "You've been through so much. I know your story, but there are things, legends that have grown around you over the years. Stories about how you saved entire units, how you turned the tide in battles nobody thought we could win. People talk about you like you're some sort of ghost." Martin's face hardened. "I'm no ghost," he said firmly. "I'm just a man who did what he had to do to survive. Nothing more." The general looked at him with a mix of admiration and understanding. "That's the thing, though. The stories aren't just stories. They're truths that others don't understand. Your actions, what you did in that jungle, in that desert, those things shaped history. And I think it's time people knew the full truth about who you are." Martin's heart skipped a beat, but he remained quiet. He had long since left behind the need for accolades or recognition. The general took a step closer. "Sergeant Major, there are too many soldiers, too many families, who need to know the legacy you've left behind. It's time to honor that." Martin turned away from him, staring out the window again. The weight of his past pressed down on him, memories of lives lost, of battles fought, of promises made and broken. "I don't need a medal, sir. I don't need anything except to be left alone." The general placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've earned your peace, but the world needs to know what kind of man you really are." Martin felt the weight of his words, but a small part of him, one he had buried for years, was beginning to question whether it was time for others to know the man behind the legend. The general's voice was steady, but filled with purpose. "Sergeant Major, We'll make sure your story is told. But first, I need to ask you something I've been meaning to know for a long time. Why did you walk away from it all? Martin met the general's gaze again, his eyes tired but resolute. I didn't walk away, sir. I just stopped running. The general smiled softly, a knowing look in his eyes. Well, it's time to start running again. The door behind them opened suddenly, and a younger officer stepped inside, holding a folder. Sir, it's ready. We've secured the transport, and the press is waiting outside. The general nodded. Thank you, Lieutenant. He turned back to Martin. The world is ready for you, Sergeant Major. It's time to step back into the light. Martin stood still, looking at the general, as if weighing his options. A lifetime of silence, of living in the shadows, was not easily erased. But somewhere deep down, he knew the time had come. All right, Martin said finally, his voice low but certain. Let's do it. With that, the general led Martin out of the room and back toward the waiting car. This time, however, there was no turning back. I will continue the story from where we left off. Martin Kelly, the elderly veteran, followed the general down the corridor, his steps slow but steady. The events of the last few hours weighed heavily on him. But there was something in the air now, something different. A sense of inevitability. A sense that his life was about to change in ways he hadn't imagined. As they reached the parking lot, a sleek black SUV was waiting with its engine running. The general held the door open for Martin, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Martin climbed inside. The general followed, sitting across from him. As the vehicle began to move, the general leaned forward, his voice measured but filled with urgency. Sergeant Major, there's something I need you to understand. What you did today, in that terminal, it wasn't just about saving a life. It was about sending a message. A message to every soldier, every Marine, every service member who has ever felt forgotten. Martin glanced out of the window, the city lights blurring as they sped down the highway. He knew what the general was getting at. His reputation had always been one of quiet humility, never seeking recognition for his actions. But the world had changed. People had changed. And now, it seemed, the time had come for him to step back into the spotlight. I didn't ask for this, Martin said, his voice quiet but firm. I never wanted to be anyone's hero. The general nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. You weren't looking for glory, but it found you anyway. Your actions have always been a testament to something more, something deeper. And now, people need to hear your story. They need to know what you did and who you are. The vehicle turned a corner, and Martin's eyes fell on the distant silhouette of a military base. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, a place he had walked away from long ago. Memories of combat, of comrades lost and battles fought, flooded his mind. He had buried those memories for a reason. But now, it seemed, they were being dragged back to the surface. The car stopped in front of a secure building on the base, and the general motioned for Martin to follow. Inside, a small group of officers and high-ranking officials awaited them. The tension in the room was palpable as the general introduced Martin. The officers exchanged surprised glances, clearly not expecting to meet the man whose name had become a legend. Sergeant Major Martin Kelly, the general said, his voice commanding attention. This is the man who saved countless lives during some of the most dangerous missions in our history. A man who never asked for recognition, but who deserves it. More than anyone. The officers stood in silence, their faces a mix of respect and awe. Martin stood still, his posture rigid, though his heart pounded in his chest. I'm just a soldier, Martin said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. I did what needed to be done. That's all. The room remained silent for a moment before one of the officers, a colonel, stepped forward. Sir, with all due respect, your story, your legacy, it's something we've all heard in whispers. But now, it's time for the world to know the truth. What you did, how you fought, it's more than just a memory. It's a lesson for everyone who wears this uniform. Martin's eyes flicked to the colonel, his expression unreadable. He had never been one for speeches or fanfare. His actions had always spoken louder than words. But there was something in the colonel's tone, something that resonated deep within him. What do you want from me? Martin asked, his voice low but steady. The colonel hesitated for a moment before answering. We want you to help us shape the future. We want you to teach the next generation, to show them what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to lead with honor. The world needs to know the man behind the legend. The general nodded in agreement. You've spent your life in the shadows, Sergeant Major. But it's time for you to step into the light. Martin stood silently, his mind racing. He had spent so many years running from the past, trying to bury the things he had seen and done. But now, it seemed, he had no choice but to confront it all, to face the man he had been, and the man he could still become. I don't know if I can do that, Martin said quietly, his voice tinged with doubt. I'm not the man they think I am. The general placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. Yes, you are, he said. You always have been. The world just doesn't know it yet. Martin looked around the room, at the faces of the officers and soldiers who had gathered there, all looking at him with respect and admiration. He had never wanted this. He had never asked for it. But now, he could see that it was his turn. His turn to teach, to lead, to show them all what it truly meant to be a soldier. With a heavy sigh, Martin nodded. All right, he said, his voice filled with resolve. Let's do this. The general smiled, the weight of the moment not lost on him. Welcome back, Sergeant Major. As the meeting continued, Martin Kelly, the quiet, humble man who had once been a ghost in the eyes of the world, began to realize that his time had come. And as he stood there, ready to face whatever lay ahead, he knew that he would never walk away from his legacy again. I will continue the story from where we left off. The meeting room was quiet, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air like a thick fog. Martin Kelly, the sergeant major who had once walked away from the spotlight, now stood at the center of it all. The officers and soldiers around him watched, waiting for him to speak, to give some kind of confirmation that he was ready to embrace the role they had all been pushing him toward. But Martin wasn't sure if he was ready. For years, he had kept his silence, kept his story hidden away like a relic in a dusty box. But now, with the eyes of the military world upon him, he felt like everything he had tried to forget was coming back to life. What do you expect from me? Martin asked, his voice low but steady. The general, who had been sitting across from him, stood up and walked toward the window, gazing out at the sprawling base. We expect you to lead, the general said, his tone unwavering. We need you to show them what it means to be a soldier, to be a leader. You've seen it all, you've been through the worst, and you've come out on the other side. Your story isn't just about the battles you fought, it's about the lessons you learned. We need those lessons to shape the next generation. Martin's gaze shifted to the floor, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life trying to distance himself from the past. The names, the faces, the battles, all of it felt like a weight he could never fully shed. But now, it seemed, the past was catching up with him, demanding to be heard. I'm not sure I have anything left to teach, Martin said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The general turned from the window, his eyes fixed on Martin. You have everything to teach, Sergeant Major. You've seen what others couldn't. You've done what others wouldn't. And now, it's time for you to share that wisdom. Martin sighed, the burden of the decision weighing on him. He had been a soldier for so long, had carried the weight of war, that he had forgotten what it meant to be something else. He had forgotten what it meant to be a teacher, a leader, a man who could help others find their way. But as he looked around the room, at the faces of the young officers who had yet to understand the true cost of war, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had something to offer. What do you want me to do? Martin asked, his voice firmer now. The general smiled, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. We need you to train them. The new recruits, the cadets. Show them what it means to be a part of something greater than themselves. Teach them what it takes to be a true soldier. We want you to be a mentor, a living example of what it means to serve with honor. Martin nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if he was ready to step into that role, but he knew that he couldn't run from it forever. The time had come for him to face the legacy he had built, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to let others learn from it. All right, Martin said, standing up straight. I'll do it. I'll train them. The general extended his hand, a firm grip that signaled the beginning of something new. Welcome back, Sergeant Major, the general said, his voice filled with pride. As Martin shook the general's hand, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The training would be hard, the recruits would challenge him, but Martin knew that it was what he had been called to do. The next chapter of his life was about to begin. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, he would no longer hide in the shadows. He would step into the light. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because the next generation of soldiers needed to hear his story. They needed to know what it meant to sacrifice, to fight, to lead. And he was going to show them. As Martin walked out of the room, the general followed closely behind, his mind already focused on the future. The meeting was over, but for Martin, the real work was just beginning. I will continue the story from where we left off. The next day, Martin Kelly walked into the training facility on the base, his footsteps heavy but resolute. The air was thick with the sound of young soldiers talking, laughing, and gearing up for their next exercise. The recruits, most of them in their 20s, had no idea who he was, and that was exactly the way Martin wanted it. He had spent a lifetime in the shadows, fighting battles that no one would ever know about. But now, as he stood at the entrance of the training field, the weight of his history felt like it was starting to catch up with him. The general's words from yesterday echoed in his mind, urging him to step into the light, to show these young soldiers what it really meant to serve. Martin wasn't sure if he could live up to that expectation, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to back down. He had never been one to shy away from a challenge. As he walked across the field, a few of the recruits noticed him, their eyes curious but unknowing. One of them, a young woman with short brown hair, stopped in her tracks and looked him up and down. "Who's the old guy?" she asked her friend, loud enough for Martin to hear. Her friend laughed, not realizing the weight of her words. "No idea. Probably one of the veterans they bring in to talk to us," he said, shrugging. Martin didn't respond. He kept walking, his gaze fixed ahead. He wasn't here to explain himself to anyone. He was here to teach. The general had set up a special training session for him that morning, one that would allow him to gauge the recruits' readiness and show them the skills they would need to survive in the field. As Martin approached the center of the field, he saw a small group of officers standing nearby, their eyes following him as he moved. The commanding officer, a tall man with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward and extended his hand. "Sergeant Major Kelly," the officer said, his voice respectful. "It's an honor to have you here." Martin shook the officer's hand, feeling the weight of his title. He had never been one to care about titles, but it was hard not to notice the shift in the air as soon as his name was spoken aloud. "I'm just here to train," Martin replied, his voice low but firm. The officer nodded, then turned to the group of recruits. "All right, listen up," he shouted. The recruits immediately fell into formation, their faces serious as they looked at Martin. "This is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly. He's going to be leading today's training session. You'll follow his instructions, and you'll do it his way. No exceptions." The officer gave Martin a small nod before stepping aside. Martin stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel as he addressed the recruits. "You're here because you want to be soldiers," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "But being a soldier is about more than just following orders. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. It's about knowing what it takes to survive when the world falls apart around you." The recruits stood in silence, watching him intently. Some were skeptical, others eager to prove themselves. But Martin didn't care about their doubts. He had his own. "Today, you're going to learn what it means to make decisions in the heat of battle. You're going to learn how to think on your feet, how to adapt, how to lead. And you're going to do it under pressure." He paused, letting the words sink in. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Martin could feel the tension building, but he didn't flinch. He had faced worse. "I'm not here to coddle you," he continued. "I'm here to make you better. You may not like the way I do things, but you'll respect it. And if you don't, you'll find out why you should." Martin turned and motioned for the recruits to follow him. "We're going to start with something simple, a basic assault course. But this isn't just about getting through the course. It's about working as a team, thinking on your feet, and never giving up." The recruits followed him to the edge of the field, where an obstacle course lay waiting. It wasn't the most difficult course, but it would test their physical and mental limits. As Martin began to explain the rules, he could feel the eyes of the recruits on him, some filled with uncertainty, others with determination. He had seen it all before, young soldiers eager to prove themselves, but unaware of what true sacrifice really meant. "This is where you learn your limits," Martin said, his voice steady. "Not just your physical limits, but your mental limits. When you're out in the field, there's no room for hesitation. You either make the decision, or it's made for you." As the recruits started to move through the course, Martin observed them closely, watching how they handled the obstacles, how they worked together, how they adapted to the challenges. He saw the ones who hesitated, the ones who struggled, and the ones who pushed through despite the odds. It was a glimpse into who they were and what they could become. By the end of the session, Martin had seen enough. The recruits were exhausted, their bodies covered in mud and sweat, but they had pushed through. They had learned the first lesson. When you think you can't go any further, that's when you keep going. As the recruits gathered around him, Martin stood tall, his gaze sweeping over them. "You did well today," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his experience. "But this is just the beginning. You'll face tougher challenges, but you'll be ready. Because you've learned one of the most important lessons of all: never stop pushing." The recruits stood silently, their faces filled with a mix of exhaustion and respect. Martin knew it wasn't just the physical training that had impacted them today. It was the lesson of resilience, of perseverance, and of leadership. And as he watched them begin to walk away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to make a difference. I will continue the story from where we left off. The next morning, Martin Kelly stood in front of a new group of recruits, the faces still unfamiliar, but the tension already present. After the previous day's training session, he could tell that they had started to understand what he was trying to teach them, but today was going to be different. This time, the stakes were higher. "Today," Martin began, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "we're going to do something more than just physical training. Today, you'll learn what it means to make real decisions, the kind that can change everything in a heartbeat." The recruits looked at each other, unsure of what to expect, but Martin could see the curiosity in their eyes. "This is not a game," he continued, his eyes scanning the group. "This is not about impressing your peers. This is about survival. And if you don't take it seriously, you'll find out the hard way what happens when you don't." The recruits fell silent, the gravity of his words settling in. Martin had been through enough to know that these young soldiers still had no idea what it meant to be pushed to their limits. The training field lay before them, but today's exercise would take them beyond it. As they lined up, Martin gestured for them to follow him to a large van parked on the outskirts of the base. "Get in," he instructed, his tone no nonsense. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances but climbed into the van. Martin sat at the front, his face unreadable, as the vehicle began to drive. It wasn't long before they arrived at a remote area of the training grounds, a section designed for live fire drills. The area was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine fading into the distance. "This is where you'll be tested," Martin said, stepping out of the van and motioning for the recruits to do the same. "Today, you'll face a real scenario. You'll have to think on your feet, under pressure. You'll have to use your training, your instincts, and most importantly, you'll have to make the right call in a split second." He paused, looking over the recruits. "The enemy is everywhere, and the only way you're going to make it out is by working as a team. Do not think for a second that you can do this alone." The recruits formed a loose line in front of him, their faces a mix of uncertainty and determination. Martin could see that some of them were already questioning themselves, their doubt written all over their expressions. He stepped forward, walking past them slowly, taking in every face, every subtle shift in their posture. "I've been where you are," he said quietly. "I've been in the trenches, on the ground, fighting for my life, for my brothers, for my country. And let me tell you something. In the field, there are no second chances. You get one shot, one decision, and that's it. So you better make it count." The recruits stood a little taller, the weight of his words beginning to sink in. "You're going to face challenges today that will push you to your limits. You'll encounter obstacles, both physical and mental. And there will be times when you'll want to quit. But that's when you need to push harder." Martin paused, scanning their faces. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make you better. And if you can't handle it, you won't make it through. That's the reality of being a soldier." He nodded toward the obstacle course ahead, a series of intense, demanding stations that would test every aspect of their training. "You'll start with this," Martin said. "And when you're done, there will be more waiting for you. But remember, this isn't just about physical strength. It's about what you're made of inside. It's about determination, focus, and the will to keep going when it feels impossible." As the recruits began to move toward the course, Martin observed their every step. He noticed how some of them hesitated, how others tried to look confident but faltered when they saw what lay ahead. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else, a flicker of resolve, a willingness to push through. The first obstacle was a tall wall, slick with mud and designed to test their teamwork. The recruits approached it cautiously, unsure of how to tackle it. Martin stood to the side, watching. He wasn't going to make it easy for them. He wasn't going to offer advice or instructions unless they asked for it. This was their test, their chance to prove themselves. One by one, the recruits tried to scale the wall. Some made it over with ease, while others struggled. It wasn't until one of the recruits, a tall, broad-shouldered man, slipped and fell back down that Martin spoke. "Get up," he called, his voice firm. "No one's going to carry you over that wall. You have to get up and try again. And this time, don't stop until you make it." The recruit hesitated, his pride wounded, but he nodded and tried again. This time, he made it over the wall, struggling but determined. The rest of the recruits followed, some with more ease than others, but each of them learning something in the process. As the day went on, Martin pushed them harder, making the obstacles more difficult, more intense. He watched as the recruits began to work together, their teamwork improving as they faced each challenge. He saw the hesitation slowly melt away, replaced by confidence and grit. By the end of the day, the recruits were exhausted, covered in mud and sweat, but there was something else there too, something that hadn't been there before. They had learned to trust each other, to push through the pain, and to keep going no matter what. As they gathered in a circle, Martin stood in front of them, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You made it through today," he said, his voice low but strong. "But don't get complacent. This is just the beginning. You've learned something valuable today, how to push past your limits, how to keep going when you think you can't. And that's what you'll need when it counts the most. Because in the field, it's not about what you've done, it's about what you can do when everything is on the line." The recruits nodded, their faces set with determination. Martin knew that they were ready for whatever came next. And as he watched them begin to head back to the barracks, he felt a sense of pride. They had taken the first step on the long road to becoming real soldiers. I will continue the story from where we left off. The next morning, the recruits assembled at the training facility, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The previous day's grueling exercise had pushed them to their limits, but today would be different. Today, Martin Kelly had something else in mind. As they gathered in formation, Martin stood at the front, his eyes scanning the young soldiers before him. There was no more hesitation, no more uncertainty. They had faced the hardest physical challenges, but now it was time to test their minds. "Today," Martin began, his voice steady and commanding, "we're going to do something different. We're not going to run an obstacle course or carry heavy packs. Today, you're going to face a situation you never saw coming. You'll need to think on your feet, make decisions that could save lives, and lead your team through something unexpected." The recruits shifted, some of them confused, others eager for whatever challenge Martin had in store. You're all familiar with the theory, but theory doesn't mean anything when you're in the field. You can't read a manual when your life is on the line. You have to trust your instincts, your training, and the people around you, Martin continued. But most importantly, you need to make decisions fast, because when you hesitate, it's too late. He turned to the side, where a set of mock buildings stood in the distance, part of the training complex. "We've set up a scenario. You'll have to navigate through a series of challenges that simulate a real-life operation. You'll be given limited information, and you'll have to work together to figure out what's going on and what needs to be done. Your objective is to secure the area and neutralize the threat. But there's one rule. You can't communicate with each other. Not a word. You have to act based on what you see and your judgment. If you don't, you fail." The recruits looked at each other, the tension in the air palpable. They had been trained to communicate, to work together, but now Martin was asking them to trust their instincts, to function without a safety net. "This will be your toughest challenge yet," Martin said, his voice filled with authority. "You'll make mistakes. You'll get frustrated. But that's part of it. The real world doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't give you time to think. It only gives you the time you make for yourself." Martin watched as the recruits prepared, checking their gear and mentally preparing for the unknown. He could see the fear in their eyes, the anxiety that came with being thrown into something they couldn't predict. But he also saw something else, determination. They were ready, even if they didn't know it yet. Let's move out, Martin commanded. The recruits followed him to the starting point of the scenario, their hearts pounding in their chests as they looked around, trying to piece together what would happen next. The mock buildings loomed ahead, and the silence was deafening. Martin led them into the complex, his footsteps silent on the gravel. He stopped at the first building and pointed to a small alleyway. You'll split into teams of 2, he said. One team will enter this building, the other will head to the building across the way. Your job is to clear the building and report back to me. But remember, you're not allowed to speak to each other. You have to figure out the situation on your own. The recruits hesitated for a moment before they followed his orders, breaking into pairs and heading off into the complex. Martin watched them carefully, his mind already working through the possibilities. Some of the recruits approached their assignments with confidence, others with caution. But Martin knew that it wasn't just about clearing the buildings. It was about how they made decisions under pressure. As the teams entered the buildings, Martin stayed at the center, watching the situation unfold through the cameras set up throughout the complex. He could see the recruits trying to navigate the unknown, relying on their training, their instincts, and their ability to work together without speaking. A few moments later, a team entered a room and froze. Martin could see them hesitate, unsure of how to proceed. They had reached an obstacle they didn't anticipate. Martin's heart rate quickened. This was the moment. The team could either take action or freeze. One of the recruits, a young man with a strong build, finally stepped forward and motioned to his partner. Without speaking, they moved into the next room, securing it. Martin nodded, his eyes watching their every move. He had seen what he needed to see. The team had made the right call, even in the face of uncertainty. As the teams continued to move through the buildings, Martin couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The recruits were starting to get it. They were thinking on their feet, making decisions quickly, without relying on communication or outside help. They were becoming soldiers. When the last team finished their mission, Martin called them back together. They stood in front of him, breathing heavily, their eyes alert and focused. You did well, Martin said, his voice low but filled with approval. You faced an obstacle and made decisions on your own. That's what being a soldier is all about. It's not about waiting for someone else to tell you what to do. It's about making the right call, even when you don't have all the answers. The recruits stood in silence, their faces showing a mix of exhaustion and pride. Martin could see it in their eyes. They had learned something today. They had learned how to think, how to trust themselves, and how to lead. It wasn't just about physical strength anymore. It was about mental toughness, the ability to handle uncertainty, and the will to push forward when everything around you is falling apart. Remember this lesson, Martin continued. The battlefield is never predictable. The enemy doesn't wait for you to be ready. And when you make a decision, make sure it's the right one. Because the consequences are real. The recruits nodded, their expressions serious. Martin knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but today, they had taken another step toward becoming real soldiers. They were no longer just following orders. They were learning to lead, to think for themselves, and to adapt in the face of uncertainty. And that was the most important lesson of all. I will continue the story from where we left off. The following morning, Martin stood in front of the recruits once again, but today was going to be different. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the way their eyes followed him everywhere. They had learned a lot, but the next step would be the hardest yet. All right, listen up, Martin's voice rang out, cutting through the morning air, bringing the group to attention. You've gone through the drills. You've worked together. But today, we're going to test you in ways you never imagined. The recruits shifted on their feet, unsure of what to expect, but Martin could see the determination in their eyes. They were ready, but they didn't know it yet. We're going to run a live exercise. Real-world conditions. Real stakes, Martin continued. We're going to simulate a crisis. You'll need to work together and think on your feet. You won't have any prior knowledge of the situation. Just like in the field, you'll have to make decisions fast, and you'll have to lead. A murmur ran through the recruits, but Martin held up a hand. This is your final test. If you can't handle this, you're not ready to be soldiers. Simple as that. With that, he turned and motioned for them to follow. The group moved in silence as they followed him to a nearby structure. It was a building they had trained on before, but today, it looked different. Dark, ominous, like something out of a nightmare. What are we doing here, Sergeant Major? One of the recruits asked, his voice uncertain. Martin turned to face him, his expression hard. "You'll see," he replied, his voice firm. "Now get inside." The recruits followed him inside, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Martin stood at the door, his back against the frame, his arms crossed. This is a hostage rescue operation. Inside, there are civilians, hostages, being held by a group of armed assailants. Your job is to get in there, secure the hostages, and neutralize the threat. You'll be dealing with multiple layers of complexity, including obstacles, surprise attacks, and limited resources. The clock is ticking, and every second counts. You don't have the luxury of hesitation. The recruits stood still, absorbing his words, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. Martin could see the wheels turning in their minds as they processed the magnitude of what he had just said. You're going in as a team. You'll need to rely on each other. If one of you fails, the entire mission fails, he said. Now let's get moving. He stepped aside, and the recruits filed through the door, their eyes scanning the room for anything that might be a threat. The building was eerily quiet, too quiet. Martin watched from his position, monitoring their movements closely. He could see the tension building as they made their way deeper into the building, their weapons drawn, their eyes darting from corner to corner. Then it happened. A shot rang out, followed by the sound of footsteps rushing toward them. The recruits instinctively took cover, their training kicking in. Martin stayed in the background, watching, assessing. He saw the recruits communicate without words, their movements synchronized, their instincts taking over. They moved as a unit, clearing rooms, securing doors, and checking corners. But it wasn't just about physicality. It was about their ability to think, to adapt, to make decisions in real time. They encountered obstacles, locked doors, unexpected attacks, and limited ammunition. But they worked through it. One recruit, a young woman with quick reflexes, took charge when things got chaotic, coordinating the group's actions with a calm that Martin hadn't expected. "We've got this," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. Martin could see the rest of the group respond to her leadership, moving faster, working together more efficiently. It was a moment of clarity for Martin. This group, these recruits, were becoming soldiers. They were thinking, adapting, and leading. It was a long way from the uncertain, hesitant group he had seen when they first arrived. He knew they weren't finished yet. There were still many lessons to be learned. But this was progress. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the final room. The hostages were secured, and the assailants were neutralized. The recruits were breathless, their bodies covered in sweat, but they had done it. They had completed the mission. Martin stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. "You did good," he said, his voice low but filled with respect. "But this is just the beginning. In the field, you won't always get a perfect scenario. You won't always have the advantage. But what you did today, how you worked together, how you made decisions under pressure, that's what it means to be a soldier." The recruits stood in silence, their faces filled with exhaustion and pride. They had passed the test, but Martin knew that the Real challenge was just beginning. They had learned how to lead, how to survive, but the true test would come when they were out in the field, when the stakes were even higher. "Remember this moment," Martin said, his voice steady. "Because when you're out there, in the real world, you'll face moments like this every day, and how you respond will define you as a soldier." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now get some rest. You've earned it." As the recruits filed out of the building, Martin stayed behind, his mind racing. They had done well today, but there was so much more to teach them. The journey was far from over, and he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But he also knew one thing for sure. These recruits were ready. They had proven themselves, and now, it was time to lead them into the future. I will continue the story from where we left off. It had been 2 weeks since the hostage rescue exercise, and the recruits were showing marked improvement. The transformation had been impressive, but Martin knew that they weren't truly ready until they faced the hardest test of all, real combat conditions. Today was that day. The training ground had been set up to simulate a live mission, and the recruits were about to face their most intense challenge yet. Martin stood at the edge of the field, watching them prepare. The tension in the air was palpable as they double-checked their gear, their movements sharp and deliberate. He could see the anxiety in their eyes, the fear that came from the unknown. It was natural, he knew. Fear was something you had to learn to control, not eliminate. Fear kept you alert, kept you alive. But too much fear, too little control, could break you. Today's exercise is different, Martin said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the nervous chatter. You're going to face an enemy. You won't know where they are, or when they'll strike. You'll have to rely on your training, your instincts, and your team to survive. There won't be any backup. You'll be on your own. The recruits stood in silence, absorbing his words. Martin knew that this would be the moment when they either proved themselves or faltered. They had come so far, but this was the true test. This is real now, Martin continued, his voice low. There's no room for hesitation. If you freeze, it's over. If you panic, it's over. But if you think, if you trust each other, and if you move like a team, you will make it through. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. But if you fail, you fail together. That's how it works. The recruits nodded, their faces hardening with resolve. Martin turned and walked toward the command tent, where the officers were waiting. He had given them all the tools they needed. Now it was up to them. As Martin entered the tent, he was greeted by the commanding officer, a tall, experienced man who had overseen countless operations. Sergeant Major Kelly, the officer said, offering a handshake. Everything is set. We're ready to begin the operation. Martin nodded, his mind already focused on the mission. Let's get started, he said. The officers briefed him on the scenario. A small enemy force had infiltrated the training area, and the recruits would have to find and neutralize the threat. There were no specific details about the enemy's location, only vague descriptions of the environment they would be operating in. You know what you're doing, Sergeant Major, the officer said. But if anything goes wrong, we'll be ready to pull them back. Martin's gaze hardened. They won't need to be pulled back. They'll succeed. I'll make sure of it. With that, he turned and made his way back to the recruits. As they gathered, Martin felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had seen these young soldiers grow, but now they would have to prove themselves. He wasn't going to hold their hands. It was time to let them take the lead. Listen up, he called out, his voice carrying across the field. You've trained for this moment. You've learned the fundamentals. Now, it's time to put it all together. You'll be operating in teams. Each of you will take on a specific role. Some of you will scout, others will provide cover, and some will lead the charge. But no matter what happens, you need to work together. If one of you falters, it will affect the entire team. Martin paused for a moment, watching their faces, studying the mix of nerves and determination. This isn't just about the mission, he continued. It's about you, as individuals, becoming soldiers. Today, you prove you can handle the pressure. You prove you can think, act, and survive under fire. You're not just playing war games anymore. This is the real deal. The recruits exchanged glances, their faces grim. They knew the stakes. Martin gave them a final nod before turning and heading toward the field. As he walked, he could hear the recruits behind him, their steps steady, their minds shifting into mission mode. He knew they were ready, but this wasn't about confidence. It was about survival. They had one chance to get it right. Once they entered the simulated combat zone, the environment would change. The enemy could be anywhere. The recruits would have to rely on their instincts, their training, and each other to make it out alive. As they reached the starting point, Martin stopped and turned to face them. You know what's at stake. You know what to do. Let's make it count. With that, he gave the signal, and the recruits moved into the training area. The sound of their boots hitting the ground, the rustle of their gear, and the quiet hum of adrenaline filled the air. The recruits spread out, moving cautiously but purposefully, eyes scanning for any sign of the enemy. They had been trained for this, but in the end, it came down to their ability to think and act in the heat of the moment. The first contact came fast and unexpected. A burst of gunfire rang out from the trees, and the recruits instinctively took cover. Martin watched from his position, his eyes never leaving them as they quickly returned fire, their movements coordinated and fluid. He could see the teamwork, the trust they had in each other. They were starting to think like soldiers. As the exercise continued, Martin's respect for them grew. They were not perfect, but they were improving. They were making the right decisions, taking the right risks, and most importantly, they were working together. By the time the exercise ended, the recruits had secured the area and neutralized the threat. They were exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat, but they had succeeded. As they gathered back together, Martin stood in front of them, a sense of pride filling his chest. You did it. he said, his voice filled with respect. You didn't just complete the mission. You proved that you're ready. Ready for whatever comes next. And that's what it means to be a soldier. The recruits stood silently, their faces tired but resolute. Martin knew that this was just the beginning. They had shown they could survive, but now it was time to show they could lead. The journey was far from over, but today, they had taken a major step forward. I will continue the story from where we left off. The next few days were a blur of training exercises, evaluations, and feedback sessions. Martin could see the change in the recruits, how they had transformed from hesitant, unsure soldiers into a more cohesive unit, a team that now moved with purpose and confidence. But even with their progress, Martin knew the real test was still ahead. Today, he was going to push them harder than ever before. They had done well under controlled conditions, but real combat didn't play by any rules. As the recruits assembled on the field that morning, Martin felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had come to care for these young soldiers, to see them as more than just recruits. They were his responsibility now. He was not just teaching them to follow orders, but to think, to lead, and most importantly, to survive. The field was quiet as Martin stood before the recruits, his eyes scanning their faces. They had no idea what to expect today. He had been preparing them for a mission that would simulate real-world conditions, but there was a difference between theory and execution. They were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Today, Martin began, his voice calm but authoritative. You will be tested in ways you've never been tested before. This isn't just about physical strength. This is about mental toughness. You will face obstacles that will challenge your ability to think and act under pressure. You'll face the kind of decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. The recruits stood in silence, the gravity of his words sinking in. Martin could see their expressions shift from confident to uncertain. They knew what was coming, and they knew that today wasn't going to be easy. You will be given a mission, Martin continued, but you won't have all the information you need. The situation will evolve as you move through it, and you will have to adapt on the fly. There will be moments when you will doubt yourselves, when you will wonder if you're making the right call. But you have to trust your training, trust your instincts, and trust each other. If one of you fails, you all fail. So, you need to have each other's backs every step of the way. The recruits exchanged looks, the tension palpable in the air. Martin didn't let up. Your mission is simple in concept, but difficult in execution. You will infiltrate an area, locate and secure a target, and extract it. But the enemy won't just sit by and let you do that. They'll fight back. You'll face ambushes, traps, and the unpredictability of real combat. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. You won't know where the enemy is. You won't know when they'll strike. But you will know one thing. If you don't succeed, the consequences will be real. This isn't a game anymore. This is as close to real combat as you'll get without being deployed. He motioned for them to follow him as they moved to the starting point of the exercise. The recruits moved quickly, their minds already shifting into mission mode. Martin led them through a dense, wooded area, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth beneath them. He kept his eyes on them, watching their movements, their body language. They had come a long way, but this mission would test everything they had learned. As they reached the edge of the training area, Martin signaled for them to stop. He turned to face them one last time before the operation began. Remember what I said, Martin reminded them. You're not alone out there. And you don't have the luxury of second chances. You're a team, and a team succeeds or fails together. The recruits nodded, their faces determined, ready for the challenge ahead. Move out, Martin commanded. The recruits moved forward, their movements synchronized, their focus sharp. The mission had begun. As they advanced through the woods, the tension in the air grew thicker. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the silence. But Martin could feel the subtle shift as the recruits adjusted to the weight of the exercise. They were alert, their eyes scanning the surroundings, looking for any sign of the enemy. The first sign came quickly, gunfire, sharp and sudden, ringing out from the trees ahead. The recruits instinctively hit the ground, taking cover behind rocks and trees. Martin crouched low beside them, his eyes scanning the horizon. The enemy had made their move. The recruits were now in the thick of it. Return fire, Martin shouted. Don't just hide, fight back. Work together. The recruits responded, their training kicking in as they returned fire. Martin watched them closely, noting how they worked as a unit, how they communicated without words, signaling to each other, covering each other's positions. They were becoming soldiers. The firefight lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Martin could see the recruits adapting to the pressure, making decisions on the fly, and moving quickly to neutralize the threat. But just as they thought the danger had passed, another wave of gunfire erupted from a different direction. Martin cursed under his breath. This was the reality of combat. It was unpredictable, and it was relentless. The recruits scrambled to find new cover, adjusting their strategy in real time. Martin knew they couldn't afford to be pinned down. Push forward, he commanded. Get to the target and secure it, now. The recruits responded with determination, moving quickly through the woods, their weapons raised, their minds focused on the mission. It wasn't easy. There were more ambushes, more unexpected obstacles, and moments of uncertainty. But they kept moving forward, driven by the knowledge that success depended on them and them alone. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached their target. The mission was a success. The recruits had proven themselves, not just by completing the objective, but by doing so with teamwork, resilience, and the ability to adapt under pressure. As they gathered around Martin, exhausted but proud, he looked at them, his gaze softening for the first time that day. You did it, he said, his voice filled with respect. You didn't just survive, you led. And that's what makes you soldiers. The recruits stood tall, their faces filled with pride. Martin knew that this mission had been the turning point for them. They had shown that they could handle the pressure, that they could think and act like soldiers. But more importantly, they had shown that they were ready for whatever came next. They were no longer just recruits. They were a team. And that team was ready to face whatever the world had in store. I will continue the story from where we left off. The days after the live mission were filled with debriefs, evaluations, and personal reflections. Martin watched the recruits grow stronger, more confident, and most importantly, more cohesive as a team. But as they completed each exercise, Martin knew that there was still one last test ahead, one that would push them beyond what they had already learned. The final test wasn't about physical strength or combat skills. It was about leadership, decision-making, and the ability to face uncertainty in the most extreme of circumstances. As the recruits gathered on the training field, Martin stood before them, his face stern, his eyes scanning each of them. He had seen them evolve over the past few weeks, but he knew that this was the real test. Today's exercise, Martin began, his voice carrying across the field, will be different from everything you've done so far. We've prepared you for the physical side of combat. We've prepared you to fight, but now you'll face a new challenge. Today, you'll be tested not only on your ability to act under pressure, but also on your ability to lead when it counts. The recruits stood silently, awaiting his next words. Martin could see the anxiety in their eyes, the weight of the final test beginning to settle in. You've trained to be soldiers. But now, you'll need to think beyond the basics. You'll need to make decisions that could change the course of this exercise and, in some cases, the lives of those around you. Martin paused, letting the tension build. The exercise today will simulate a real combat scenario. You'll be given a situation, and you'll have to respond with limited resources and no backup. You will have to make decisions on your own, with the clock ticking and the enemy closing in. You will lead your team through the chaos. You will make the hard calls. He watched their faces closely. Some were still uncertain. Others looked ready for the challenge. But Martin knew that only time would reveal how they would handle the pressure. Your mission is simple, Martin continued, but it won't be easy. You will be inserted into a hostile environment. You'll need to locate an injured ally, extract them to safety, and neutralize the threat. But there's one catch. Half of your team will be on the other side of the area, and you'll have no communication between teams. You will be leading, and your decisions will affect your team's survival. He stepped forward, making eye contact with each recruit. You'll face ambushes, dead ends, and unexpected obstacles. Some of you will want to turn back, but there is no turning back. You either complete the mission, or you fail together. Understand. The recruits nodded, some visibly anxious, but all determined. Martin saw it in their eyes, the same drive he had seen in his own eyes many years ago. The exercise began with a sharp command, and the recruits sprang into action. They had been briefed on the basic layout of the training area, but what they didn't know was that the scenario would evolve as they moved through it. Martin watched from his observation post, the field ahead of him alive with movement. The recruits moved cautiously at first, their weapons ready, their eyes scanning for any signs of danger. The silence was broken by the crackle of gunfire in the distance. The recruits immediately took cover, their training kicking in as they responded to the threat. The first recruit, a young man named Cooper, took charge, issuing quick, concise orders to his team. "We've got to move to the left. Now, stick together." The team followed his lead, moving as one, their coordination flawless. Martin nodded to himself as he observed from his vantage point. Cooper had proven himself as a leader in that first moment of chaos. His ability to assess the situation and act quickly had kept his team alive. But the situation was about to get more complicated. As the recruits moved deeper into the area, they encountered the first real obstacle, a large, walled compound that they needed to breach in order to complete the mission. The wall was tall, and the gate was locked. Cooper looked around at his team, his mind racing. The pressure was on. He couldn't afford to hesitate. "We'll breach it here," he said, pointing to a section of the wall where the rocks were loose. "We need to move quickly. Prepare for the next phase." The team worked together, using what little equipment they had to create an opening. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. They got through. As they moved forward, the enemy made their next move, ambushing them from behind the compound walls. The recruits returned fire, quickly falling back to a more defensive position. Martin could see the confusion on some of their faces. This was real. The stakes were higher than they had ever been in training. But Cooper was quick to regain control. "Form up. 2 on the left, 2 on the right. We need to flush them out." His voice was steady, his instructions clear. The recruits responded without hesitation, positioning themselves in the best cover available, laying down suppressive fire while the others moved forward. Martin watched as they adapted to the situation, their coordination improving with each move. It was exactly what he wanted to see. They were thinking on their feet, trusting each other, and making decisions quickly. The firefight continued for several minutes, but the recruits managed to push the enemy back, neutralizing the threat. They moved quickly after that, navigating through the rest of the compound with a renewed sense of purpose. As they reached the injured soldier, a young woman named Davis, the team quickly secured the area, checking for any additional threats. With the casualty in hand, they began their extraction. The recruits moved as one, each member performing their role flawlessly. They knew that the mission was far from over, but they were prepared for whatever came next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the extraction point. The mission was complete. The recruits had made it through, but it wasn't just about completing the objective. It was about how they had worked together, how they had led when it mattered most. As they gathered around Martin, exhausted but proud, he looked them over. "You did it," Martin said, his voice low but filled with respect. "You faced a real scenario, and you handled it. You worked as a team, you made decisions under pressure, and you never stopped fighting. This is what it means to be a soldier." The recruits stood taller now, their faces proud, the weight of the moment settling in. They had passed the final test. But for Martin, he knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. They had proven they were ready for the field. Now, they were soldiers. And that was the most important lesson of all. I will continue the story from where we left off. The recruits stood in front of Martin, their faces tired but filled with a sense of accomplishment. The mission had been their hardest yet, but they had succeeded. As they regrouped, Martin couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had made it through the final test, and now, they were no longer just recruits. They were soldiers. The last few weeks had been intense, full of challenges, failures, and moments of triumph. But the journey wasn't over. Martin knew that while they had proven themselves, the real test would come when they were out in the field, facing real threats. As the recruits caught their breath, Martin addressed them one final time. "You've all done well," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You've shown me that you can handle the pressure. You've learned how to lead, how to fight, and how to trust each other. But this is just the beginning. You're not finished yet. You've learned what it means to be soldiers, but you've still got a long road ahead." The recruits nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of pride and exhaustion. They had been pushed to their limits, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Martin looked at each of them, seeing the changes in their eyes. They were no longer unsure or hesitant. They were soldiers now. I know you're tired, and I know you're ready for a break, Martin continued. But I want you to remember one thing. What we've done here, what you've learned, will stay with you forever. You'll carry it with you into every mission, every challenge, every fight. The world outside of this training ground is unpredictable, but you've got what it takes to face it. He paused, letting his words sink in. The recruits stood silently, processing the weight of his message. You've learned the hard way that being a soldier isn't just about the battles you fight. It's about the decisions you make, the people you lead, and the sacrifices you're willing to make. It's about the moment when you have to make a choice, when everything is on the line, and you have no one to rely on but yourself. Martin took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the recruits once more. The real world is waiting for you. And when it comes, you'll be ready. I've seen what you're capable of. You've earned my respect, and I'm proud to have been your instructor. He paused for a moment, letting the finality of his words settle in the air. The recruits looked at each other, their expressions filled with pride. They had made it through the toughest training of their lives. They had earned their place as soldiers. You've made it through, Martin said finally. Now, go out there and prove it to the world. With that, he turned and walked away, his steps slow but purposeful. He knew that his job was done. The recruits were ready for whatever came next. As he walked toward the exit, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey they had been through together. It had been a long, hard road, but they had made it. They had become soldiers. And he knew that wherever their journey took them, they would carry the lessons of this training with them, the strength of their bond, and the knowledge that they could face anything as long as they stood together. I will continue the story from where we left off. The recruits had completed their training, their tests, and their trials, but today, they would face something more. Something final. It was time for the graduation ceremony. Martin stood at the back of the formation, watching as the recruits lined up, their uniforms sharp, their faces stoic. He could see the pride in their eyes, the quiet sense of accomplishment that came with completing something so difficult. He had seen them at their lowest points, struggling, questioning, unsure of their place in the world. But today, they were soldiers. As the ceremony began, the commanding officer stepped forward, his voice strong and commanding as he addressed the recruits. Today, you stand here as the next generation of soldiers, he began, his tone filled with authority. You've proven yourselves, not just to us, but to yourselves. You've fought, you've bled, and you've sacrificed. And for that, you have earned the right to call yourselves soldiers. Today, we celebrate your achievement, and tomorrow, you will face the world with the confidence that comes from knowing you are ready. The recruits stood tall, their chests swelling with pride as the commanding officer continued. Sergeant Major Kelly, would you please step forward? Martin stepped out of the formation, his boots heavy on the ground. He felt the eyes of every recruit on him, but he didn't flinch. He had been in situations far more intense than this. He had been through wars, through loss, through moments that had broken others. But today he was here for them. The officer continued, Sergeant Major Kelly has been with you every step of the way. He has led you, pushed you, and made you better than you thought you could be. For his dedication and service, I would like to present him with a token of appreciation. Martin was handed a plaque, one that read, in honor of his dedication to the future of our military, Sergeant Major Martin Kelly is hereby recognized for his outstanding service and leadership. Martin nodded, accepting the plaque, but his mind wasn't on the ceremony. It was on the recruits, on the young men and women who had trusted him, who had followed his lead. They had become soldiers, but more than that, they had become leaders in their own right. The officer finished, and Martin turned to face the recruits. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You've all come a long way. I've seen you at your best and your worst, and I can say without a doubt that you are ready. Ready for what comes next, ready for the world. But remember this, it's not the battles that define you. It's not the medals or the victories. It's the people you become along the way. You've learned the hard lessons, and now, you carry those lessons with you, wherever you go. He paused, letting his words settle in. When you face challenges, when you face the enemy, you won't be alone. You'll have each other. You'll always have your team, and that's something no one can ever take away from you. He let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. I'm proud of you. And I hope, one day, When you look back on this moment, you'll remember it for what it was. A turning point in your life. A moment when you chose to be something greater. And I know, each one of you, will go on to be a leader in your own way. Martin turned to the recruits, meeting each of their gazes. He could see their eyes filled with understanding. They were ready. He had done his job. The ceremony ended with applause, and the recruits filed out, their heads held high. As Martin watched them leave, he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle, from the young soldier who had once been unsure of his place, to the leader who had shaped the next generation. It was a journey he never thought he'd take, but one that had brought him peace. The world outside the gates of the base awaited them, and Martin knew they were ready to face it. He had given them the tools to succeed. Now, it was their turn to lead. Martin stood there for a moment longer, watching as the recruits disappeared into the distance. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the commanding officer, a proud smile on his face. "You've done something remarkable here, Sergeant Major. These soldiers are a testament to your leadership." Martin smiled back, but there was no need for words. He had already said everything he needed to. He had shaped them into soldiers, into leaders, and that was enough. This emotional story takes you through the journey of a seasoned soldier, Martin Kelly, who trains a group of recruits to become strong, resilient, and capable soldiers. As Martin pushes them to their limits, they face challenges that test not only their physical strength, but also their ability to make crucial decisions under pressure. With moments of intense action, this emotional story shows the transformation of these young recruits as they struggle, adapt, and ultimately prove their worth. Through failures and triumphs, they learn what it truly means to be a soldier, to lead, and to work as a team. The emotional story unfolds as Martin watches the recruits grow, shaping them into leaders who will face the real world with courage and strength. From the first steps of training to the final test, this emotional story captures the essence of sacrifice, teamwork, and leadership. By the end, Martin knows that his work is done. He has molded these recruits into warriors who will carry these lessons for the rest of their lives. This emotional story isn't just about battle. It's about the growth of character, resilience, and the bond formed in the face of adversity. If you love stories that inspire and touch the heart, this emotional story will stay with you long after you've finished reading.